Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of King's unit tier list and faction focus video for the city-states. In this video, we'll be talking through who the city-states are, how do they play and what is their faction identity, before jumping into a tier list format to rank every one of their units according to the classic S to D tier rankings. Now, just as a reminder, we have the ranking system that we'll be using for this video up on screen now. An S tier unit is one that dominates both list construction and play for the faction, usually by being either overpowered or undercosted. S tier units tend to define the faction in a negative way, and an example of an S tier unit is pre-update City-States Chariots. An A tier unit, by comparison, is kind of the good version of an S tier unit. Yes, it's very strong, yes, it is played frequently, and yes, it is a core faction strength, but it doesn't toe over the line into being overpowered or undercosted. Plentiful access to A tier regiments is actually pretty important to faction identity, and having a decent mix of A tier units is a signpost generally of a good and well-built faction. B tier units are supplementary units. These are units that are useful and relevant and can be powerful, but are balanced either by ease of access or applicability. A B tier unit is usually one that is good within its use case, but that use case has restrictions for whatever reason. Lots of B tier units is usually kind of the spice of life for good faction balance, and in an ideal world, the bulk of a faction's units fall just about in B tier. An example of a B tier unit is the Siegebreaker Behemoth Inspires, which is very powerful within a specific kind of niche, but difficult to either use or include in a list just casually or easily. C tier units are where we start straying into units that are weaker or hard to use, but still in the realm of competitively and casually viable. C tier units are the hear me out or I'm trying to make this work category, where a unit is maybe perhaps very slightly behind the curve, but a player in search of a unique build or a different experience can make them work or get some use out of them. An example of a C tier unit is something like the Crimson Tower Heavy Cavalry in 100 Kingdoms. And then finally, D tier units are units that fall below even optimistic competition viable kind of standards. Usually, D tier units are ones where perhaps the model concept is good, but something about the rules causes them to not properly function. D tier units are quite rare in Conquest because the design team usually pays quite a lot of attention to making sure that the rules for regiments function, but there are examples of them, and one example is the Mimetic Assassin Inspires, which has an outstanding concept, but the rules in Last Argument of Kings just don't really work. Now, with that ranking system laid out, let's jump into talking about who city-states are and how they play. Now, aesthetically, as you might expect, how the city-states look is very much like the city-states of the Greek Hellenistic period, but with a big dash of both mythology and fantastic technology. In essence, steampunk Greeks, and that's reflected through the entire miniature range. You have perfect phalanxes arrayed for battle, fighting alongside giants and steampunk creations, and things like minotaurs and satyrs, all coming together as a fantastic and interesting looking force. Mechanically, there are a couple of rules that are unique to city-states that start to shape how they play, but it's actually their unit roster that sets their fundamental identity. Those unique mechanics first, though, are auxiliary stands and the strategic stack. Auxiliary stands are unique stands that can be added to regiments. You can only have one of them per regiment, but they're almost always a good idea to include. Adding a single Minotaur into a unit of Thorakides, or Hoplites, for example, generally speaking, is a very efficient purchase. They inherit the defensive stats of the regiment that they join, but tend to have more wounds, more attacks, higher cleave, etc. Just generally speaking, a good buy, and aesthetically looks really cool as well. The strategic stack is a mechanic that is meant to represent the city-states pulling off feats of maneuver, where what you can do is at any point during your turn when you would draw a card, you can instead take it from your command stack and put it face down into the strategic stack, pass play back to your opponent, and then at any point later in the round, after you finish activating a regiment from your command stack as normal, you can chain into and double activate using your card from the strategic stack. In essence, you give up a point of tempo at some point early in the round to utilize that later in the round. Now, there are some limitations to the full utility of that, kind of like living up to its fantasy, but at minimum, it represents an additional activation during those parts of the game where activations are very valuable to have, usually the earlier parts of the game. And there are a number of abilities you can access on your units that chain off of coming off of the strategic stack. So it usually represents a buff as well. Now, Both of those mechanics, auxiliary stands and the strategic stack, are interesting and useful, but to me they are not the primary drivers of the city-state's identity. Instead, that comes from their unit roster. City-states units tend to be highly specialized with pretty distinct strengths and weaknesses. It's going to be quite rare that city-states units are entirely well-rounded. Instead, there will usually be limitations on those regiments that allow them then to excel at something else. You will have, just on regular line troops in city-states, defensive attributes that would be completely unable to be accessed in any other part of the game in any other faction. You might see mobility or offensive output on a regiment that again is very, very high for a regiment that is otherwise just a baseline mainstay, but maybe in terms of durability or cost, they're accepting some limitations there. Maybe they have to use the strategic stack to access the maximum of those strengths. In all cases, what you have are units that are specialized, and it's that specialization across the entire roster of city-states that leads me to conclude that the identity of city-states really is as a faction of technology. And what I mean when I say that is you need to approach city-states thinking about this specialized roster that you have as a suite of tools that you can draw on to address specific and repeatable challenges that you expect to encounter. A lot of other factions kind of have the ability to say, this is my strength, this unit or this combination of units, they together are strong and I will use them, and other people have to respond to those strengths. City-states can be played the same way, but historically, their greatest accomplishments have always come from instead looking at what other factions are posing as their maximal strengths and responding to those strengths with counters. And there are actually multiple examples of city-states players accomplishing successful tournament results by adopting that kind of approach. One of the very first, possibly the very first major competitive outing we ever saw city-states play in was very early into their release and very early into the second edition of Conquest, which at the time was just an extremely gunline-centric meta. And so, at the time, basically the whole world was looking at Adepticon, expecting to see nothing but reams and reams and reams of gunline armies. At the time, it was things like Spires using Vanguard clone infiltrators, Nords using Bowchosen and Stalkers. These things were appearing en masse because of how powerful they were at the time before various different balance update patches have changed those things. And so genuinely the competitive expectation was that the top 3 or 4 or 5 lists at Adepticon would just be varying flavors of gunline army. Instead, a city-states list with 0 ranged regiments won, because it was built really specifically to counter the absolute shit out of all of those gunline armies. Now, it's very fair to say that factions don't win events, players do, and the player that won Adepticon that year, Ben from the United States, is both an extremely skilled and extremely knowledgeable player, but it was that knowledge and that meta read that was such a strong contributor to his success that year. He hard countered the meta, and that's something that city-states can do. And as their roster has fleshed out, we have seen that arrive in other cases as well. At a personal and more local level, my local Canberra community went through the same kind of phase that I think many other people did, where we went through the aura of death and auto hits period, where there were regiments doing the rounds in multiple factions that could just run to engage you and then say, "Excuse me, sir, I'd like you now to take 25 automatic hits." And it was one of my local city-states players that broke the back of that metagame in my community by taking hoplites with a Lokogos and an Aristarch Warlord, and taking multiple of these pieces and just saying, okay, cool, before this unit activates, it's going to be defense 4 and untouchable. From those 25 hits, the average number of wounds that it takes is a couple. It will completely no-sell your offense at a much, much cheaper cost than that big unit of Praetorians cost you. I will pin them in place with a cheaper regiment that will take almost no damage, and then I will take your army apart using the forced mismatch that generates. And so it's this kind of technology-focused play where you think about your specialized units and which of them is most appropriate to apply to whatever prevailing meta conditions you perceive that really produces the best outcome out of city-states and which city-state excels at. And so, yes, at a very high level, This means that city-states reward a couple of things. They reward good fundamentals of play. Because you have specialized regiments, you have to deploy and maneuver those regiments to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. Any regiment with phalanx, for example, you cannot afford to expose its flanks. Play them accordingly and they will reward you, play them poorly and they won't. But beyond that, this is a faction where you are rewarded for tailoring your list construction to respond to prevailing meta considerations and meta conditions. Bring lists that are built around predicting and responding to likely matchups, and that is where city-states perform best. They're very cool for that reason. And while it is absolutely true that all factions in Conquest to some extent reward good fundamentals and good list construction that responds to the metagame, city-states are really uniquely suited to make that part of their identity. Now, there are, of course, some limitations to accompany the faction's strengths. As much as having highly specialized units allows you to leverage your significant strengths, those units can come with significant weaknesses, and if you put them in the wrong situation, either in play or in list construction, they will perform poorly. If you build a list that does not adapt to changing conditions, you are going to have poor results, perhaps without really understanding why. You need to be flexible and adaptive and responsive in your city-states list construction. This leads into what I would consider to be the second major limitation of city-states, which is that they are a faction that really rewards having a fairly complete collection, because you want to be able to adroitly respond to the meta conditions in your local community or any events that you're traveling to. And this makes the faction kind of expensive in terms of cash. It is not really possible to build a small and focused city-states army if you want to leverage all of the strengths I've talked about. You need kind of a complete collection, and especially with the cost of some regiments like Chariots, that can get pricey very, very quickly. Something like 4 Chariots, which is a number I'm going to recommend in terms of chariot ownership, sets you back, I think, $70 per chariot, and depending on the exchange rate, if you are in a country with a weaker currency, the cost of that can add up very quickly. That's just something to consider. You need to think about city-states in terms of the collection and if they're right for you, and if you're willing to build that collection up over time and accept that they're kind of a long-term project, both in terms of the time but also capital expense. Now, finally, in terms of the last major limitation of city-states, it's really just around the strategic stack, which is that it is a fundamentally limited mechanic. It's very easy to look at it, and particularly to hear it described as the city-states performing feats of coordinated maneuver, and think that it's capable of accomplishing more than it is. In practice, and in my experience, even very, very good city-states players do not usually find that they can use the strategic stack to the maximum kind of promise that it proposes. It is not easy to use it to reorder your command stack, for example. It is not easy to use it to pull off late turn feats of maneuver in the late game, because once you are in a position where combat is joined and multiple regiments are threatening multiple other regiments, the loss of tempo early in a round really just isn't something that you can easily tolerate. The strategic stack at that point becomes very much a secondary mechanic that you just make use of occasionally, usually when you need to unlock buffs. It's still good, it's still a good mechanic, but is at its strongest in the early game, mostly because at that point in the game, activation count is at its highest utility, right, before combat is joined. And so if you are getting into city-states, you really should expect the strategic stack especially to be much more of an early game mechanic most of the time. As you build more experience with the faction, you will find over time more and more opportunities to use it creatively even later into the game. But you do need to be aware of its limitations as a mechanic. It is good, but it really doesn't dominate the play experience or hugely inform the play experience with city-states, in my experience. And so, with that stage set, right, thinking of the city-states as a faction of technology who use their highly specialized units as a suite of tools to respond to meta conditions, challenges, and threats they expect to encounter, let's jump into the tier list and talk about how the city-states play and how their units fare. Now, you might already notice that this tier list looks very slightly different to the one we had in the previous episode. And that is very much in recognition of the fact that city-states units tend to be fairly highly specialized. Highly specialized units, by their nature, tend to fit most easily in the B category according to the ranking conditions that we've set, And I found, sketching out this episode, that so much of the city-states roster fit inside B that I actually needed to just expand out B to add a little bit of nuance. And so in this case, yes, we are still ranking from S to D, but we will add some granularity in the B category to include B pluses, Bs, and B minuses, just to get a better feel for how so many of these city-states regiments perform. Now, as usual, we are going to start with characters and then work our way up through the weight categories of regiments, but we are going to make a particular exception in this case because the first regiment we have to talk about when talking about city-states is Chariots. Now, Chariots are a regiment that comes very close to straying into S tier territory, and in fact, if you recall how we talked about unit rankings, historically in the past they absolutely have. They dominated both list construction and the play experience against city-states, and that is still mostly, but not completely true, after a number of adjustments and changes over the course of many different game updates. Now, despite a series of successive nerfs, Chariots are still extremely important to city-states as a faction, and I would argue after the most recent update, actually in a sense more important than ever, thanks to a very important change that was made, the removal of flank and the addition of vanguard. Now, chariots by themselves are highly valuable regiments. They are fast, they turn on a dime thanks to the silhouette that they occupy, right? It's two stands vertically aligned. That means they wheel very easily. They have excellent firepower output relative to their points cost, both the Scorpios and the Floggerbollen. They are the only really significant, powerful ranged output that city-states have at time of recording, and so they fill an extremely valuable role in that respect. They are also able to be taken as 2 chariots per restricted slot. Each of those chariots is an individual regiment, which allows you to pad out your regiment and therefore activation count without having to excessively spend on characters, which is highly valuable. They just do a great deal of things that are very, very valuable to the faction. The reason why I think they are less dominant in terms of the play experience, that's dropping down to an A, but actually ironically more important to the faction after the latest update is, as mentioned, that change from flank to vanguard. And that is hugely relevant in terms of changing not how chariots play, but how the entirety of city-states play, because it means that chariots now add die to the reinforcement pool, which gives you choice as to how your turn unfolds. Now, this is, I think, in a very real sense, kind of a buff or at least an improvement to the wider faction. When chariots had flank, yes, every single chariot would turn up on turn 2 if you wanted it to. The rush of chariots onto the board would occur, and your opponent would go about the business of trying to figure out how to respond to the chariot swarm, which led to a very homogeneous game experience for both players, but also led to a degree of inflexibility for the city-states player. Yes, the chariots would all turn up, but you were at the mercy of reinforcement rolls as to anything else in your list, and so if you wanted to build lists that focused on other important medium regiments, you had to accept the fact that you were rolling a relatively small number of reinforcement dice in the medium category, and that constrained for actually quite a long amount of time the ability of city-states to be like agile within the construction of their lists in basically the entire of their list, but especially in the medium unit category. Now, chariots have vanguard, which means that no matter when they turn up, they're moving 11 inches onto the board. They make excellent use of the reinforcement line because they turn so easily. And so whether they arrive on turn 2 or turn 3 or turn 4, you can just about guarantee that they will have an impact on the game the turn they arrive because their threat range of any of the table edges is very high, especially for Scorpios. And so chariots have the flexibility of arriving at any point in the game and still being valuable, but because they contribute dice to the reinforcement pool, and in fact a large number of chariots contribute a large number of dice to the reinforcement pool, city-states are now in a position where chariots are just as valuable as ever, but they have a hugely consistent and large medium reinforcement pool that allows them to prioritize other significant regiments. And so, whatever medium regiment exists in city-states that might be best applied to the meta conditions at hand, city-states players are now in a position where they can guarantee that those regiments arrive at a time and in a place of their choosing because you roll so many medium reinforcement die and you can comfortably deprioritize most of your chariots if you need to. Do you need to bring medium regiments? Like, Phalangites and hoplites, infantry regiments onto the field early. You can now reliably do so in multiples. Do you need to rush the board with cavalry? Is that what the conditions of the metagame demand? You can now do that reliably. Do you for some reason need to delay those pieces to be responsive? You can do that reliably. And so by having this large pool of dice, not only do you tend to get fairly consistent results because of how standard deviations work, but rather than being forced to bring all of your chariots on turn 2, you have choice. And that means that chariots are an enabler for city-states and open up multiple other list builds to become viable when previously they weren't, even if, in the strictest sense, the change from flank to vanguard is possibly conceivable as a small nerf to chariots themselves. Chariots right now are, to me, the quintessential A tier regiment, and in fact, if I was going to add an A plus tier to this tier list, I would possibly even consider putting them in there. But at time of recording, I consider them to be, relative to their points cost and their damage output, a fair regiment, right? They are very attractively costed, but they are not undercosted, but they add a huge amount of value to the city-states at large. These are just about the only regiment in the army that I would consider an auto pick, and the fact that most city-states players, if you are playing competitively, will probably want to own at least 4 chariots, that's 2 restricted slots worth of chariots, is part of why I felt it necessary to mention the cost of collecting city-states when talking about their limitations. Overall, though, this is an excellent regiment. If you like the look of them and think that they're awesome, there's a very real chance city-states are a faction for you. A very, very good regiment, and our first A-tier regiment, and with them spoken about at length, let's talk about city-states characters. The first of our characters is the Aristarch, and he slots relatively comfortably into the A tier as well, although definitely below Chariots in terms of his importance to the list. Now, the Aristarch is a reasonable fighter and an excellent choice for the very powerful Blades of Euclides artifact if you want to make him into a real beater in combat, but he's also one of the best, if not possibly the best warlord choice for the faction. And there are a couple of things that the Aristarch does that make him a very natural warlord. The first is that his supremacy ability allows you to do a couple of things, but the most important is that it allows you once per game to start your round with a regiment in the strategic stack. Now, this is hugely important because it is literally the only way in city-states to overcome the unappealing mid-game tempo loss that the strategic stack demands. And that's really important because it is the only way at any point in the late game that you can have that very powerful double activation that also serves to trigger the abilities you have in your army that might key off of the strategic stack without taking that unappealing tempo loss at a part of the game where you can't really tolerate it. Now, it's a bit of a learning curve to make best use, to figure out when to make best use of the timing of that supremacy, but the power of it is really the only way to unlock the maximal benefit you can get out of the strategic stack. And for that reason, like most of my city-states list, even when there are other options, most of my lists lean toward an Aristarch Warlord, just because of how powerful that interaction is in terms of maximizing the unique benefits of the faction. He also has some of the best battlefield orders. He's not a spellcaster or anything, but the battlefield orders of the martial city-states characters are really nice. And in particular, he can give Untouchable to the regiment that he is in, and other regiments nearby that have access to a Lokogos attachment if he is the Warlord. Untouchable is a very powerful rule, especially when combined with Defense 4, which you have access to on infantry in city-states. And all of that comes at a very appealing 90-point price tag, which makes him just a generally excellent choice. He is also Resolve 4, which is just really, really good on a character and makes him a natural leader of any of the infantry regiments, because Resolve 4 is not an attribute you can otherwise access in city-states easily in your infantry, so just a fantastic A-tier character. Next up, we have the Eidolon, who definitely and unfortunately sits much further down the tier list than his Aristarch friend. Now, the Eidolon does have some positive qualities. He can reach 9 attacks from a single character stand, which even with no ability to access like artifacts that would improve that is still a colossal amount of damage. But that's kind of all he does. He has a bunch of other rules, but ultimately the combat directives that you choose are just a math problem, and 9 attacks is the correct choice the bulk of the time. And while 9 attacks on a character is really, really cool, there is not that much going on in his warband that is particularly appealing, and he can't be the Warlord. Because he can't be the Warlord, he is always going to be at least something of a second tier character, and there is really just nothing he has going on that makes him incredibly appealing, apart from the fact that he's a little bit of a combat monster. But clocking in at 120 points, if you want a combat monster, you can achieve as good or better just by spending those points on upgrades on other characters. For example, an Aristarch with Blades of Euclides at about the same price point is going to be as good or better than the Eidolon, which really does just leave him sitting very much in the B- tier. Not without application, but not fantastic. Now, jumping back to characters that are pretty fantastic, we have the Hipparchos. The Hipparchos is our cavalry commander. He has a supremacy that is built entirely around access to and use of cavalry and chariots. And I just spent a whole lot of time talking about how chariots are really, really good. Something that actually that defines both the Aristarch and the Hipparchos is that they are your best access to chariots in this faction. And so kind of just by definition, both of them are going to be very important and very useful. And it helps that both of them have good stat lines and good warbands otherwise. The Hipparchos does come behind the Aristarch a little bit in terms of general applicability in this tier list, but he has good combat stats on his own merits. He enables some very powerful combinations with medium to large cavalry regiments through use of things like the initiative mastery. He has a good and flexible warband that includes good mainstays which themselves unlock access to chariots. And finally, he has a supremacy ability which, while I would say probably takes, generally speaking, a little bit of a backseat compared to something like the Aristarch, does still offer a tantalizing and interesting build around that we have seen in play with some city-states list. Overall, just a good character, like a good and solid character, and because of the warband that he brings and the access that it gives, definitely sits in the A tier. Next up, we have the Mechanist, who has really only somewhat recently been rescued from the at best kind of C tier. But right now, in terms of use, he sits pretty cleanly in the middle of B tier. Now, by himself, he offers a suite of spells which he is not fantastic at casting, but after the most recent update, he's at least not terrible at it. He is a Priest 5, none of his spells have scaling, and most of his spells are Attunement 3, which means that provided he's not being interfered with, and for generic buff spells on his own units, that's usually pretty easy to manage. He has a good chance of casting basically all of the spells that he has access to. This offers a couple of very significant playmaking spells. He can give Juggernaut to regiments as a spell, which means City States actually has access to a lot of Juggernaut in this faction, both off of relics and off of his spell and natively on some units. He also allows you to turn light regiments and medium regiments into heavy regiments, which allows regiments like Thorikides to one-shot and objectives like as early as turn 2, which can be very significant for scenario playmaking. And he also has some buffs that work specifically on Clockwork Hoplites, which you can use as build-around regiments if you take him as the Warlord. Now, Clocklights aren't a regiment that you can spam under normal circumstances, but with a Mechanist Warlord, they go from being heavy to being medium, and we just spent a lot of time talking about what city-states can do with access to medium regiments thanks to the power of Chariots. Now, the Clocklight spam list is not something that we've seen emerge as dominant in the meta yet, but it is viable off the back of a Machinist Warlord character. And thinking about city-states as a faction of technology, that is a list archetype which we could see at some point in future its time coming. Now, the only thing I think that keeps the Mechanist out of at least B plus tier is that one of his most interesting spells is a little bit of a whiff in terms of reliable casting. He has one spell, which is Attunement 2, his only Attunement 2 spell, which allows a regiment to ignore hindering terrain. Now, this spell being Attunement 2 is unfortunately a massive trap. This spell, Iron Stride, is just not something that you can use opportunistically, right? If you have a plan that revolves around the ability to ignore hindering terrain, you are kind of by necessity going to put a unit that would otherwise suffer from hindering terrain behind that hindering terrain. And you cannot base a plan that involves deploying a regiment in a position that would otherwise cripple them around a just about 50% chance to cast off of that kind of a spell. It might be better than that, but it's a sufficiently high failure rate that any list or strategy that goes, ooh, I will use Iron Stride on my unit of cavalry and they will be able to make impact attacks when they charge through this hindering terrain, is just inevitably going to run into the situation where, oh, you failed the spell and you failed it again. Guess you just screwed yourself out of 2 turns with this regiment because you put themselves in a position where they were relying on access to that spell. But with that as a notable and significant trap with regards to use of the Mechanist, everything else about him is pretty cool and he fits reasonably comfortably in the B tier. Next up, we have the Promethean Oracle coming in at B+. The Promethean Oracle is a giant character, and while he can be a warlord in a list built around lots of use of giants, most often in more balanced lists, he will see play just as a standalone regiment with at least one Promethean giant in his warband allowing you to take him, because you have to have at least one mainstay regiment in his warband. Now, he has an excellent stat line, he is highly durable, he is dangerous, but this is probably time to talk about how city-states interact with their heavy choices in lists. Now, how many heavy regiments are fashionable in a conquest list is something that will change from faction to faction and just as a meta consideration over time. It is not outside the realms of possibility that we will see a future environment, perhaps as a result of scenario changes, where multiple factions have more comfortable ability to take many heavies in a list. But right now, at time of recording, city-states really are very much mostly a single heavy kind of faction. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. It is possible to make city-state regiments that do use multiple regiments of heavies, but with such a focus on medium regiments, and the way that city-states can engineer a consistent medium reinforcement curve, that kind of list construction, as varied as it is, doesn't leave a huge amount of space for multiple heavy regiments. A single heavy regiment that you can automatically bring on turn 3 fits pretty nicely in with the city-state's broader battle plan. But a second and definitely a third heavy regiment, right now in terms of list construction, doesn't fit in as well. And there are some reasonably appealing heavy choices that we have access to in city-states. And yes, indeed, the Promethean Oracle is one of those appealing choices. And monster characters generally, particularly ones that are not like overcosted to account for being a character, and I would argue that the Promethean isn't overcosted. 260 points is pretty damn fair for what you get. Right, character monsters are really valuable because they are themselves a regiment. They add not just to your activation count, but more importantly to your regiment count without ever paying the premium that comes with being a character. And so you have, for 260 points plus the mandatory cost of a Promethean, a really very solid combat character who is held back only by being a heavy regiment, which is why he doesn't escape the B tier and go up into the A tier, because for city-states, being a heavy regiment is pretty much always going to guarantee that you fit somewhere at least in that B tier, because it is just not a faction that accommodates lots of use of heavy regiments. They will always be somewhat restricted and therefore always somewhat niche, and therefore always at best a B plus regiment. But the Oracle absolutely is a B plus regiment, very solid stats, absolute beater, can hold the line by himself, very durable, just a well-rounded unit. Next up, our final character and another infantry character, we have the Polemarch, who also comes in as A tier. Another very viable warlord choice. He buffs his regiment really heavily with +1 clash and tenacious, as well as giving a nice aura of resolve rerolls in an aura around him, and he's also just a very solid combat character. A natural choice for him is Atlanta's Spear, which will turn him into a 7 attacks, cleave 1, clash 3 flurry character, which just does really good consistent damage output in basically any regiment that he's in. Now, his warband doesn't include Chariots, but it has plenty of good stuff in it. He is good on his own merits. He's absolutely not too expensive, coming in at only 90 points. That goes up to 110 with Atlanta Spear, but that is a very reasonable price point for the character that you get. And he, for me, basically slots in exactly next to the Epakos. Could be to the left of him, could be to the right of him of any given time. In fact, right now, let's just pop him a little bit to the right of the Epakos, just because he doesn't have access to Chariots in his warband, but nevertheless a very solid character, comfortably sitting in A tier, very easy to include and use because of his cost and general usefulness in basically any city-states list. Now, with our characters ranked, it's time to move on to the very small selection of light regiments that exist in city-states, and that means starting with Selenoi archers. Now, on paper, Selenoi are a weirdly perfect counter-skirmisher range regiment, having a nice volley, 4 shots per stand on volley 2, which is very serviceable for a reasonably cheap light regiment, and they have the loose formation rule, which means that they're very, very good at counter-skirmishing and counter-early light range units. They can also move forward and set a reinforcement line, which is generally just a fairly appealing prospect for only 130 points. They're also a mainstay, which is nice, but that's kind of where the utility for them ends, mostly because, for whatever reason, they don't seem to fit right now hugely well into city-states. I do see lists with them from time to time, but the thing about loose formation especially is that city-states have actually a really large number of other rules that make them, if they want to be, very well suited for teching into anti-gun line operations. And so that leaves Selenoy not as a regiment that has a really ubiquitous battlefield role, but which something that becomes more of a sometimes food, and especially their ability to set a reinforcement line is one where they take second fiddle to another better light regiment. It's really just that competition that takes them only into the B- tier at best, but I have absolutely seen them in some lists. The range pressure that they exert, the poke and good ability to survive counter-ranged attacks is just still pretty useful. It's just that in terms of the good and specialized units the city-states has access to, right now their use case comes up a little bit less often. And it comes up a little bit less often because, frankly, what they are competing with in the light regiment category is Thorakides. Now, Thorakides are an excellent light regiment that I nevertheless think the community perhaps slightly overrates at the moment, mostly because there is a little bit of an addiction right now to being able to score with light regiments, or perhaps better phrase is being able to score on turn 2, which Thorakides can grant to the list because they can have an auxiliary stand in them, a very powerful Minotaur Therian. That Minotaur Therian can be made into a scoring stand thanks to a mastery called Combined Arms Drills that makes all auxiliary stands count as one extra stand for scoring purposes, which means that even in a light regiment you have at least one scoring stand. Now that's very useful, but it does not justify taking tons and tons of Thorakides in a list, and yet that seems to be what I see quite a lot when I look at lists that City-States players are playing. Now, despite the fact that I think that presently they are currently overhyped, because scoring early in the game is very useful, yes, but it is absolutely not the thing that decides games, it is just influential. Despite that, everything else about Thorakides is really good. They themselves are okay combatants, but they are defense 2 with a shield, which is frankly a little bit rare in terms of the durability that you see from light regiments. They are cheap enough to add additional stands to. The Therian himself is a bit expensive, but his damage output is massive. The Therian unlocks really good play in terms of destroying objectives because he has reliable impacts and does a lot of damage himself. And finally, they have a very nice combination of abilities where they have Tenacious 2 against range attacks, which is basically as good or better than Loose Formation at weathering light ranged poke from enemy ranged regiments. But they also, if they come off the strategic stack, have access to Fluid Formation. Now remember, this is a light regiment. They will move up onto the board, they will use Vanguard to set the reinforcement line further up than the Selenoy do. They will survive ranged poke, etc. They will posture to be able to attack, and then all of the things I said about the strategic stack, right, where it can be a little bit difficult to really deliver on the promise that the strategic stack makes, and that includes using the strategic stack to unlock the abilities of your regiments, you have the most flexibility to use the strategic stack early in the game. When are Thorakides most active? They are most active early in the game. And so, while other regiments might have abilities that key off the strat stack, and which you're like, well, I'm never really going to be able to make maximal use of that, because by the time that unit is engaged in a way that I might want to use the ability, I just won't have the flexibility to use the strategic stack easily because of the tempo loss. Not so with Thorakides. The early game, which is when they will want to use the fluid formation granted by the strategic stack, is the point of the game where you have the most flexibility with the strategic stack, and that just makes them a really complete package. Now, I don't think it catapults them up into A tier. I think the love affair that the community currently has with light scoring is not fully justified when you consider the total cost of the package that you're getting there. I also think people have very much lost sight of the fact that Conquest is a 10-turn game, and if players just learn patience, then one round of scoring is very rarely going to be fully decisive unless players allow the scoring differential to get into their head and cause them to make bad decisions. That's why I say early scoring is influential and important, but not necessarily decisive. But despite all of that, Thorakides are still a very appealing package. They fit into a great many, not all, but a great many lists, and so they are going to sit, spoiler alert, at the very top of the B+ tier in the faction for the remainder of the tier list. Very, very good unit. In my opinion, they should usually be a one-of unless you are trying to accomplish something specific or respond to specific meta conditions, but absolutely very valuable. Now, from here, we start the all-important medium category with our first medium regiment, the Agama. Now, Agama, for me, are a well-rounded, solid, stabby, highly mobile regiment that nevertheless sits very comfortably kind of in the middle of a good, solid B-tier regiment. Now, in terms of their specialization, Agama have good output and good mobility at the expense of, relative to their cost, kinda average durability. Defense 2 and a Shield Resolve 3 is fine, but for a 170 point regiment that pays 50 points per stand, is on kind of the lower end of resiliency. They can take a hit here or there, but they can't really survive a sustained brawl or a big punch, which they don't want to have to survive because what they should be doing is making use of their offense, but especially their mobility, to get around the board and contribute where they are most needed. With March 6, they're pretty fast for infantry, and with Fluid Formation, their signature ability, they have really impressive maneuverability. Some of the most impressive plays I have seen from City States players have not been just using Fluid Formation to get threat extension, although Agama can absolutely do that, because they can play kind of wide, you can put a polemark in them, you can build a decent sized regiment, they can fling the edges of their regiment out wide, angle that toward the enemy, use that to gap close, and then make a very aggressive long range charge that does a lot of damage because they have a high volume of cleave attacks. Yes, that's a very impressive move, but actually the most impressive plays I have seen with Agama have been using Fluid Formation to actually just relocate them to a different part of the battlefield. That ability to recommit and reposition forces is actually something that not every city-states list will have access to, because the phalanx regiments that city-states have access to are not nearly as mobile. You cannot turn a phalanx on a dime because you can't safely expose its flanks, and so once a phalanx regiment is deployed, it's pretty much committed. Agama don't have that restriction. Now, as valuable as that is, not every list warrants using Agama. They are a little bit expensive, they are not durable, they are a mainstay in plenty of cases. The polemark unlocks them very easily and fits in them very naturally. But they are very much a regiment that fades in and out of popularity, basically based on the demands for maneuver that the metagame or the city-states player's personal preferences put on the list. Very solid, very balanced, very fair regiment with a good balance of strength and limitations, and a unit that will absolutely make you want to make best use of their strengths while mitigating their limitations in true city-state style. Next up, and our first C-tier regiment for city-states, we have the Minotaur Haspists. Now, Haspists are not a bad regiment, but they are not a regiment that really excels at anything. Despite looking like they should be durable, relative to their points cost, they're not really that tough. Like, they are tougher than Agama, but Agama are fast, fluid formation, and dangerous. Haspists have some vanguard, but otherwise nothing that really gets them around the battlefield. They are also not especially dangerous in melee, and we're actually going to indulge briefly in a cross-faction comparison here and just kind of see what 180 points gets you for a brute regiment elsewhere in the game, and we're going to have a look comparing Haspis to something like, for example, Warbred in Woodrune. Now, comparison is the thief of joy. The purpose of this tier list really is to think about how regiments work inside of the faction. But if you compare Warbred and Haspis, you will be very disappointed in Haspis as a result. The offensive output in particular is massively in Warbred's favor. They have more attacks, they have native cleave 2, and they have access to chant mechanics to give them even further offense with things like deadly blades. And so you might think, okay, well surely the Haspis make up for that with durability. Nope, Warbred are just more durable. They have the same resolve, they have the same wound count, and they have the same defense, except Haspis are defense 2 with a shield, whereas Warbred are just base defense 3, which means they aren't vulnerable to being flanked and they aren't vulnerable to Linebreaker. These are both 180 point brute mainstay regiments, and while, yes, Haspis do have Vanguard, Haspis do exist in a faction that is very good at propelling medium regiments onto the battlefield, they just don't perform hugely well in the medium role. And if you wanted to spend really just a few more points, you can generate something like a hoplite unit that, yes, is a little bit slower, but is much, much, much more durable thanks to the combination of the Lokagos wound count, stacked defensive buffs, etc., that outperform as a holding regiment. Haspis are left as a regiment that is trying to do a little bit of fighting and a little bit of durability, and City-State's just not really a faction that wants mediocre, underperforming generalists. So Haspis, they can work, you can fit them in a list. I have seen some lists, not this patch, but previous patch, where I make the argument maybe that one unit of Haspis would have been a good fit. Their time does come from time to time, but not a strong unit, and if you buy a city-state starter, the main unit for Haspis is as the much more useful Haspis auxiliary stand in things like hoplites. Now, speaking of hoplites, B+, firm B+. And in fact, while we're talking about phalanx regiments, let's just get phalangites up there as well because both are worth talking about at the same time. Hoplites and phalangites are kind of two sides of the same coin. Both of them are phalanx regiments. Phalanx is a rule that improves your defense significantly, both your defense and your resolve, against attacks from your front arc, but limits your ability to charge to a fixed +3 inches, and prevents you from performing the Inspire action. Now, you can still get access to Inspired by activating off of the strategic stack or charging and a few other different ways. But generally speaking, Phalanx is a rule that locks you at least partially into a defensive role. Now, historically, City States players have gone back and forth depending on recent updates as to one of these is always better than the other or vice versa. Now, this is a position that you may personally choose to subscribe to, but I would say right now, both of these phalanx regiments fit very comfortably as very solid mainstay cornerstone B plus regiments, where the damage output and scalability of phalangites makes them best suited to larger regiments with characters in them, and the durability of hoplites makes them much better suited to smaller regiments, either as little self-contained character bunkers, doing things like holding a mechanist, or maybe even just a small regiment with a polemark as a way of boosting your activation count. But my favorite loadout for hoplites is actually maybe 3 of them plus a Haspis auxiliary with a Lokagos officer. The Lokagos allows them to count as if they have a character within 8 inches inside them for purposes of resolve, which will put them as resolve 6 against front arc attacks most of the time, thanks to phalanx and unit size. And also, if that character is your warlord, benefit from any battlefield orders that they give. And so this means that a little block of hoplites, just a mainstay, like borderline MSU, maybe 4 stands, is, for sub 200 points, Defense 4 untouchable, Resolve 6 against attacks from the front arc. That is like ridiculous high watermark defense on a unit that is just piggybacking off of easily available special rules, like no special deployment of your characters. The leash range on the Lokagos getting the benefit of the character nearby is massive. It's excellent and self-contained as a small holding regiment, while you run something like a much larger, probably 6 stands is about the minimum, including a character, but more is better, a much larger Phalangidi regiment that can brawl and do damage and get priority access to the strategic stack if it needs to, because the Doralates officer in its case performs very well. Two sides of the same coin, but I will comfortably run lists that include both. Usually it's just one solid Phalangidi block, and then one or more smaller hoplite blocks, but both are extremely valuable, and having access to them I find is really nice. Again, you can absolutely build lists without them, which is why they are not in the A tier category, but they are some of my favorite regiments in the faction. Now, just a quick note, both received additional rules in the last balance updates. Phalangites received a rule where if they activate off the strategic stack, they get a small aura of death. I have never remembered this in any game. And Hoplites got a rule called Hold, where they grant opportunist to other regiments engaging enemies that are also engaged with the Hoplites. This is something that you can use from time to time, but it is generally better to think of it as a signpost mechanic that is more about telling you how Hoplites are best to be used, and not something that you really want to salivate about going out of your way to make use of or really building your list around. It is actually something that will come up from time to time. It works particularly well, I have actually found, with City-States monster regiments, who tend to be very well positioned to play alongside little hoplites blocks. But it's also very good on things like cavalry charges into the flank, just to really push the damage of something like a companion cavalry MSU hitting something in the flank. Not a bad rule by any means, but it's off the core mechanics of the hoplites, right? The shield, the defense, the phalanx giving them such high defensive stats, especially when combined with an Aristarch Warlord and a Lokagos, that really exemplifies for me why they are such a useful regiment. Now, I mentioned companion cavalry just now, and so this is our next medium regiment. Now, these guys are a fascinating regiment because you really do make trade-offs when you look at their stat line, but the overall package is very useful, but by no means obligatory to take. You will usually take companion cavalry only as part of an Eparchos warband, but an Eparchos warband is very clean with 1 Eparchos, 2 units of companion cavalry, and then 2 sets of chariots. That is a warband that splashes very cleanly into any army list that wants to make use of it, while not being mandatory for any army list to take. It's just a really nice setup if you wanted to use it. Now, what the companion cavalry are speed 8, good impact count, good attack count, good clash, and dread, all for a very attractive 140 points, which sounds like a fantastic deal, except their defense 2, evasion 1 with 4 wounds. Now, this means dread will actually get them through particularly clashes against weakened regiments, right? If companion cavalry hit a regiment and ding it up a little bit, there is a very good chance that dread will carry them through the resulting clash. But what you absolutely do not want to expose these guys to is long range, armor piercing 1, or even no armor piercing shooting, because they will just shed stands. A unit of longbows, a unit of hold ballistae, magma sorcerer spellcasting, enemy city-states chariots, these are all things that will just take chunks out of companion cavalry units, and so deployment of these regiments is absolutely critical. Companion cavalry, I would argue, are actually a massive beneficiary of the chariot change, just because that clean and predictable reinforcement curve that most city-states list can build is also, by definition, going to include some regiments consistently turning up on turn 3. And it is turn 3 arrivals that I think Companion Cavalry generally fit very well in, because you want to deploy them only once you know where the counters that your opponent has to them are deployed. And it's usually by about turn 3 that the clear and best position for Companion Cavalry has materialized on the field. And so, for example, a kind of idealized run out for city-states is going to be something like, on turn 1, your infantry, sorry, not on turn 1, your lights arrive, on turn 2, your phalanx blocks and maybe 1 or 2 chariots arrive, and on turn 3, your companion cavalry and the remainder of the chariots arrive. They're a unit that naturally is comfortable arriving later, and being able to do that consistently as part of a good reinforcement curve is actually very beneficial to them. And if you can set up a battlefield condition for them where they are not playing into their hard counters and can make maximal use of their abilities, they're a really solid regiment. The Hipparchos and Companion Cavalry and Chariots have become an extremely common and popular warband in city-states, and for good reason, but because they are such a finely balanced mix of strengths and weaknesses, very comfortable, top of B tier, but not quite into B+. Next up we have Inquisitors, and this is actually a regiment that I will admit to having a difficult time ranking, just because I very, very rarely see them. Now, on paper, their speed is solid. Speed 7 with Unstoppable is a decent threat range, and their offensive output is pretty sound, right? 6 attacks with Cleave 1, Clash 2, and Flurry, that's just pretty good damage for 180 points. But while it's pretty good, it's not necessarily outperforming Agama. It's not really outperforming Companion Cavalry. It's not really hugely outperforming anything. And while they're not hugely fragile, Defense 3, Resolve 4 with 5 wounds actually frankly compares reasonably favorably to Minotaur Therians. Sorry, Minotaur Haspests, where you have 1 less wound but 1 more resolve. The general absence of force multiplication, like there's only one way to get a character into them, that character can't have any meaningful mainstays. They are fairly gated behind the warbands that they can be in. They are accessible only, I think, as a restricted to the Mechanist or a mainstay as the Eidolon, and the Eidolon, as we've already said, is not a particularly standout character. I just have not seen these guys on the battlefield in, I think, months, and I have city-states players locally who are avid experimenters. And so while I think they at least have a clearer use case than Minotaur Haspus, because they are not significantly less durable, and they are faster, have a longer threat range, and have more damage output, I am just not sure what the use case for them is. But city-states are a faction of tech, and so, somewhat optimistically, I am putting them as a B+ regiment, mostly because I have a suspicion that at some point there will arrive a situation where they are the tech that you use to respond to some kind of a situation. I'm not sure what that is, hence it being a somewhat optimistic ranking, but it is a somewhat optimistic B- for Inquisitors. Next, we have another medium and the first of our non-character giants, the Promethean. Now, Promethean sits somewhere between B- and B, frankly. He's the very top of B- or very bottom of B. I am putting him at the bottom of B- for now, but I would actually personally encourage City-States players to take much more of a look at him with the recent change to Chariots, because he is exactly the kind of unit that benefits really nicely from the medium reinforcement curve that City-States now have access to. Now, in terms of general stats, he's basically very well rounded for a fairly reasonable points cost. He is speed 7, He's got 16 wounds at Defense 3, Harden 1, Resolve 4, and 11 attacks at Cleave 2, Terror 1 is a very serviceable offensive profile. That's within spitting distance of the Archangel, and as a 100 Kingdoms player, I sing the Archangel's praises. He's also a priest for the purposes of interference, and he will, on turns that he charges and or clashes, be able to occasionally cast spells that are actually pretty solid offensive or defensive buffs. You can almost always find some use for reroll 6s on defense and reroll resolve rolls of 6, or reroll 6s to hit for any attacks, by the way. That does work on ranged attacks and clash +1. And while the power of these spells is definitely limited by the fact that they only go off after he activates, which means they really can be challenging to fully maximize because they are so gated behind an already important activation occurring, they are nevertheless nice to have, and the rest of the package is very sound. He has that wonderful monster durability where he can take 16 wounds and still be 100% effective. And some recent experiments that I have had running multiple giant lists alongside those little hoplite blocks to try and make use of Opportunist have actually had fantastic results. And so basically for all of those reasons, as well as the fact that you need to take a Promethean to unlock the really attractive Promethean Oracle, he is at least at the top of B-. 210 points is a little bit expensive to really say, okay, yeah, he's a snap pick B, but he is one of the regiments that I would probably most recommend City-States players who are maybe a little bit rusted onto preconceptions about their faction to reevaluate in light of changes that have occurred over, say, the last few months. Now, next up, and our first and only D-tier regiment, we have Saturoi. Now, the history of Saturoi is fascinating to talk about because they are a really interesting case study of how difficult it is to balance certain rules and interactions. Now, on release, and for the entirety of the game up until the most recent balance patch, Saturoi had a unique ability that allowed them to always come in off a table edge at any point, regardless of the presence of enemy regiments or the reinforcement line. This turned them, on paper, into a fearsome ambush regiment because they could walk in off the table edge, like right at the back of the opponent's, basically along behind your opponent's army. They would come in on the far side of the table, off the table edge, next to your opponent's deployment zone, and threaten rear charges into your opponent's army. Now, that was the fantasy, and it was a fantasy that proved basically impossible to balance in terms of the tension between casual and competitive play. Parabellum balance for both of those things, right? The concerns of competitive players and the concerns of casual players are both important because while it is competitive players who will stress test and break your game and to an extent influence how casual play occurs, it's casual play and the fun of casual play that just makes up the majority of your paying customers. And what an ability like Saturoi tended to produce is a situation where competitive players knew how to respond. They knew how to pinch off deployment zone arrivals, block the arrival of Saturoi, respond to them when they did arrive, and generally just manage the threat of a regiment that was otherwise restricted and a little bit expensive and a little bit fragile. Now, I would definitely make the case that there was a little bit of a conception amongst competitive players that because Saturoi could be solved by competitive players who knew how to deal with them, they were therefore useless, which is a very, very weak take because it completely overlooks that it takes the dedication of units and resources and activations and especially positioning to comfortably counter Saturoi, right? Like most of the time, for example, when I was playing against Saturoi, I would have regiments dedicated literally to blocking their arrival in off the table adjacent to my deployment line, which, yes, comfortably stopped Saturoi from arriving behind my army, but required multiple units dedicated to being a long way away from the battlefield for a long time. That's a concession. That is a concession in terms of position and resources that was exploitable by a canny city-states player because those resources dedicated to merely stopping the threat of Saturoi were not being deployed elsewhere, which meant that a single regiment of Saturoi, as long as it hadn't yet arrived, exerted an outsized influence on my positioning on the battlefield, despite the fact that they could be solved meant that many players kind of just felt that they were not very useful because they can be solved. And while I think it was just very much a mistake on the part of competitive players to just think that because something can be solved, it is therefore useless, that's a very binary and very foolish take. Saturoi were nevertheless thoroughly reworked, and I suspect they were reworked in large part not because of the probably erroneous perception in competitive play that they were solved and therefore bad, but because in casual play they were not solved, and getting your gooch robustly tickled by these guys after they turned up behind your army and charged you, for casual players who did not have the knowledge of how to respond to this regiment, was itself a pretty rough and brutal experience. And so, because you had a regiment that competitive players probably erroneously felt was bad, and casual players felt was overpowered, they kind of inevitably attracted a rework. Now, the rework unfortunately has not landed. Parabellum have kind of reconfigured them into a medium class regiment that a character can now join. They aren't irregular anymore, and they have a Pathfinder rule and a large vanguard. Your opponent isn't allowed to disrupt any reinforcement line that they set, and so there's kind of this idea that the Saturoi will turn up and then set an aggressive reinforcement line that your army will then capitalize on. But they're a medium regiment, which means they don't arrive until turn 2, which means they don't set a reinforcement line until turn 3. Do you want to know what other regiment exists in this faction that does set a reinforcement line that is going to be present on turn 1 so that there's a reinforcement line on turn 2, and then will be further up the board on turn 2 so that there's a reinforcement line on turn 3? It's Thorikides, sitting there in B+ tier, rendering the Saturoi just hopelessly obsolete. And what that means is that Saturoi are basically just almost as expensive, very, very bad Agama, and they're restricted on top of all of that. They are just a regiment that cleanly meets the definition of its rules just don't work right now, and so they are sitting in D tier. I strongly expect they will attract another rework at some time in future, but for now, they're pretty much the only do not take under any circumstances regiment in the faction. Now, from here, we move on finally into our heavies category. And as we talk about heavies, remember what I mentioned about how heavies function in city-states. City-states really are pretty much a single heavy faction. I do think there is some room for access to two heavy lists some of the time, maybe in different meta conditions or with a very specific plan. But most of the time, these heavies will be strongly competing for that fairly coveted slot. Now, the one exception to that is Clockwork Hoplites, our first heavy regiment. These guys are a comfortable B tier regiment. They are very durable. They are also very expensive. And their damage output is good enough when combined with their durability to make them just a pretty good turn up and fight basically anything regiment that they might need to. They have hardened, they are automatons, so they don't take resolve checks at all, which means there is virtually no offensive tech that works well against them. Cleave is not fantastic, Terror is useless. That durability combined with just good offensive output makes them good at fighting anything that you might need them to. It is only the fact that they are heavy that really consistently holds them back. But in an army led by a Mechanist Warlord, they're mediums instead, and that is a massive change to their performance curve. As mediums, they are still very expensive at I think 190 points per regiment, but all of a sudden they fit completely into the city-states game plan of that wonderful medium reinforcement curve, and you can even use Carrier of the Godflesh to push one regiment per round all the way up to Harden 2, which really does completely no-sell almost any enemy offense that would be played into them. Now, that is a very specific army configuration, which is why they are slap bang in B, the category for powerful but niche units in the list, but they are absolutely capable of being a powerful but niche regiment in the list. You can run them as a one-of in a non-machinist warlord list, although I would argue there are probably other heavies I would take over them in that case, in fact multiple other heavies, but as a machinist warlord regiment selection, and as a mainstay in machinist warbands, very, very serviceable. It's its own kind of army at that point. It doesn't share a lot of DNA in terms of like regiments that you will share with other standard city-states list, which makes it, again, an expensive choice because you'll be buying possibly multiple mechanists and multiple hoplite regiments, but that is nevertheless very cool as a potential archetype. Now, next up, we have the Hephaestian. Now, the Hephaestian is not necessarily bad just looking at it on its merits, but one of the heavy regiments in this army kind of has to be the worst heavy regiment, and that heavy regiment is the Hephaestian. Clocking in at a relatively expensive 230 points, you get basically all of the same stuff as the Promethean, but in exchange for being heavy rather than medium, you get 1 extra point of cleave, 1 extra point of terror, and access to very dangerous offensive spells rather than the Promethean's buffs. There is no change to the durability of the two characters, however, or the two monsters, however. And while the Hephaestion does still have the benefit of that monster durability, where you can deal 15 wounds to him and not reduce his his like a durability or his effectiveness at all, ultimately the fact that he is exactly as durable as a Promethean and has the same number of attacks as a Promethean with only the improvements to cleave and terror to tip the scales in his favor in terms of damage output, and is more expensive than a Promethean, means that, look, he is dangerous, right? Cleave 3, Terror 2 is very scary as an offensive output, but he's 230 points, and there are other heavies in the list that are more clear in their application than just does damage. And so for that reason, the Hephaestion to me sits very cleanly in the listen, I'm just trying to make this work, hear me out kind of category. He is not a D tier unit, but he is a C tier unit. Next, and third to last, we have the Sacred Band. Now these guys sit basically exactly next to the Clockwork Hoplites for me, but for slightly different reasons. The Clockwork Hoplites, I think, are worse than Sacred Band in a straight comparison, but you can make Clockwork Hoplites into a build around. You can build armies that make lots of use of Clockwork Hoplites, whereas you can build armies that just enjoy splashing one regiment of Sacred Band in. And the main reason for that, Sacred Band themselves, totally serviceable stats. Good speed for infantry, good resolve, decent wound count, average defense of 3. Pretty good offensive output with 5 attacks per stand, clash 3, cleave 2. That's really solid. The main thing is that they have a free spellcasting action every round, which can do a couple of different things, but the important thing is that they can heal themselves. And that is the only source of healing in the entire army. And that's for good reason, because there is durability that we have access to in city-states that would make healing potentially very, very powerful. And so it's very tightly gated as a mechanic that we have access to, and it is only available to the Sacred Band. Now, as a single unit, usually just an MSU, although it's actually not terribly difficult to scale them up, 50 points per additional stand just for the wounds that you get is not a bad buy. But because their priest level doesn't scale up at all, they are usually taken as an MSU, and that makes them into a pretty decent brawling regiment. They can engage an enemy regiment one-on-one, they can usually reasonably comfortably win that fight, they can heal any damage that they can sustain, and then move on to the next engagement. That's just a good solid use case. Why they fit into B tier, rather than say B minus, is that they synergize from there very nicely with Sacred Band auxiliary stands, because both Phalangides and Agama can take Sacred Band as auxiliary stands, and in both cases it is almost always correct to do so, just because the offensive output of a stand of Sacred Band is thoroughly worthwhile the extra points, and they have more wounds than either of the stands baseline in those regiments. But if you take a Sacred Band stand just because it's good on its own merits in either of those regiments, you can now target that regiment with the healing spell from the Sacred Band. And having access to just that little bit of extra healing, right? It's able to top up stands. If you're on full health, it's often able to restore a damage stand. It's not a ton of healing, but it's a little bit in a faction that is otherwise very much balanced around not having access to any healing at all. That is just a synergy that emerges that you don't really have to pay aggressively for. Because the Sacred Band auxiliary stands in those other regiments are so appealing, if we decide that we take a unit of Sacred Band, just because it's a solid heavy regiment to round a little bit of offense into our lists, we get that synergy basically for free. That makes a one-of regiment of Sacred Band in any list that includes at least one Sacred Band auxiliary stand just a really nice solid pick. Yes, niche, yes, not for every single list, but good and usable. Very much kind of the perfect example of a solid B tier regiment, and so that's where we're putting them. Next up, our final giant of the list, the Talos. Now, this is a lad that since release has sucked a lot of air out of City States list construction, and frankly kind of still does to some respect. And perhaps to my mind, not in a way that is entirely warranted, but he is very solid. This guy is a brick wall. He counts as 6 stands for seizing objective zones. He is hardened 2, he is fearless, he has a shield, which means he's defense 4, resolve 4 against most attacks, and he even brawls fairly well, not fantastically, but he's cleave 1, terror 1 with 12 attacks and a clash 3. That's enough to go a few rounds and eventually clear through enemy regiments that he is fighting. And while he is very expensive at 260 points, 20 wounds with those defensive stats kind of justifies that cost. Now, on release, he had the flank rule, much like Chariots did, and he had the flank rule basically because if he did not have flank, then he was always the only heavy in your list. It was too important to bring him on turn 3, which meant that any other heavy just didn't get in any air in the list. And so because of his effectiveness as that brick wall kind of piece, he just pushed other heavies out unless he had flank. They have removed flank from him and given him Vanguard, but I think he's still kind of the only heavy in a list most of the time that you take him. Now that does put him in some tension with the Promethean Oracle, because both of them really are kind of fighting for that slot. The addition of Vanguard 3 to the Talos really hasn't alleviated that. Yes, he can move 13 inches up the field on the turn that he arrives. That is not enough additional speed to be like, oh, I'm very comfortable with him arriving on turn 4. You can potentially have games where he arrives on turn 4, but realistically, I think it is the Talos and the Oracle in competition. Which of those you want as your one heavy if you take either is very much dealer's choice, but you do pretty much want only one of them most of the time. Either is good. The Oracle is more well-rounded. Its offense is better, and its defense is only marginally weaker. The Talos, on the other hand, is just a restricted slot in at least one other warband. He is easy to unlock. Whereas taking the Oracle means taking minimum of 2 giants because you must take a Promethean, which makes him harder to splash into a list. Both are excellent though, and have a very solid role in any list that they're included in. Now, I would make the note that I think perhaps people have over-focused on the Talos in the past. It was kind of easy to do so when he had flank, because he really was a regiment that benefited from it. Heavies really like having flank because of the 1 or 2 heavy problem that frankly many factions struggle with. But I think a lot of people have had experiences against Taloses where they kind of just come to the conclusion that they must be invincible, because they attack them head on and break their wrist trying to punch out God. If you find yourself playing against a Talos, and I cannot stress this enough, you really have to attack him from the flank. That might mean pinning him down with a regiment and then hitting him with something, but the amount of damage that you deal to a Talos, particularly with melee attacks, improves massively when you get those flank charges in. Not only do you circumvent the shield, which means you push more damage through, but the reroll on resolve checks takes his resolve 4 from really quite good to actually really quite fallible. And so for any given attack, it's something like an 80 or 70% damage increase if you can just land those hits in the flank instead. And because the Talos is a 260 point model, and often kind of a linchpin piece, it is totally okay to dedicate excessive resources to bringing him down. And I can and have one-rounded him in the past with a single regiment just because of that vulnerability that he has to being hit in the flank. Bear that in mind if you play against one. Do not give him the clean frontal attack that he wants, and by the same metric, if you are a City-States player using a Talos, treat him with the same care and respect that you would your Hoplite and other Phalanx regiments, because he wants his flanks protected just as much. You will occasionally have games where you can yeet him across the battlefield, use his 6 stands of scoring weight to seize a zone that your opponent didn't think you would move 14 inches into, but do that very sparingly because the shield is hugely important to his survival. Now, last, and definitely not least, we have our last heavy regiment, Minotaur Therians, coming in as well, kind of clean as a B-tier regiment. Now, these guys are a regiment that have historically struggled for a very long time, but Parabellum has slapped buff after buff after buff onto them, and if, after being given Tenacious and Juggernaut, a City-States player cannot make use of them, that is a them problem and not the consequence of any balance issues with the Minotaur Therians. Yes, they are only defense 2, but Tenacious and 6 wounds means that they should absolutely be able to endure just perhaps a little bit more damage than your opponent would like, and if you can just connect with these guys, and you should absolutely be able to connect with Speed 6 and Juggernaut, they are the highest damage output bar none relative to their points cost in the faction. 5 attacks each means 16 attacks from the regiment, but they also have 3 impact attacks on Clash 3 Brutal 1 Terror 1, 16 attacks from an MSU, with a whopping Clash 3, Cleave 3, Line Breaker, Terror 1. Means that there's nothing else in the faction that does as much damage as these guys if they connect, and if they need to, they can do a March charge with a 17-inch threat range and still get some decent damage in, thanks to those impact attacks. This is just a colossal damage output unit. They're very focused in that respect, they are very specialized, but this is a regiment that can force even a Talos down to saving on 2s. That damage output coupled with very serviceable threat range, coupled with just enough durability, thanks to 6 wounds and tenacious if nothing else, means that this is a regiment that has all of the tools it should need to deliver on the promise of that damage output, and that just makes them a really good solid heavy. They are perfectly positioned to turn up and take maximal advantage on whatever board state you can arrange for them to deliver that damage output. And at only 190 points, they suck almost no air out of the rest of your list. Now, they are very specialized, and because they're very specialized, they're one of the units that is the reason why we have multiple B tier categories in this tier list. For me, they sit right next to the other heavies in this category. They are a B tier and a good, solid B tier, alongside Clocklights, alongside Sacred Band. We're going to put them very slightly to the left of either of those because I think they have a clearer use case, but this is just a good, solid unit. Comfortable B tier, and the last regiment that we had to rank, which means that this tier list is now done. Now, just to close out the video, if you've enjoyed that, please do like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. If you want to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I mostly cover other wargames like Infinity, but I do like covering Conquest, and I am happy to take topic requests from channel supporters, including on things relating to Conquest. I am eventually hoping to cover every faction over a period of time in this format, so if you like the video, do let me know. If you have any feedback, do pass it on. Otherwise, we'll be back in future with more Conquest content. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.